I'm going to be honest and say that I really don't like Metroid Prime. I used to claim that I never did, but that isn't true. I did used to like it when I played it for the first time in 2008. Bear in mind, this was the version for the GameCube. I remembered liking it and thought at the time it was pretty good. But then, when I started playing it again in 2017, around the same time I started doing my now unfinished Let's Play of Star Fox 64, my opinion of Metroid Prime changed. By this time, I had already grown to not like first-person games on the GameCube. Seriously, I don't think any first-person game on the GameCube is good. Metroid Prime was no exception. If I was ever asked if I could play that game again, my response would probably be something like this. I'd rather take every copy of that game and smash them all to pieces with a baseball bat. If I haven't made it obvious enough, I can't stand Metroid Prime. Yes, I'm one Metroid fan who actually hates Metroid Prime. A lot. That might be pretty shocking to most of you, but it's true. Now you might be asking, why do I not like Metroid Prime like I used to? Well, here's why. In 2012, I got Metroid Other M on the Wii as a Christmas present. I played it and spent so many hours trying to finish it, even if I didn't get every single collectible there was to find. I won't say it wasn't frustrating, it really was at times, but that aside, I honestly did enjoy the game. Mostly. I can safely say that Other M isn't the best Metroid game in the world, but it's not the worst either. It's a decent entry in the series that to this day still gets bad press, from critics and fans alike. At first I couldn't understand why. To be fair though, there were some things in the game that I thought didn't work. The scene where Samus has PTSD when seeing Ridley before fighting him didn't really make a lot of sense, but at the same time, she didn't have much emotion, if any, in the other Metroid games either, Fusion being the exception. At least she actually snapped out of it and was able to handle Ridley just fine. Another thing I didn't like was the first-person segments. For those who aren't aware, in Other M, you only use the Wii Remote to control Samus. Just the Wii Remote by itself. When you point it at the screen, the game will go into a first-person perspective, like the Metroid Prime games. This is one of the worst mechanics in the entire game. You can't move around while in first-person mode, and to make it worse, there are parts of the game where you are forced into this perspective, whether it be to look around for something important or to fight off certain enemies. The latter is the worst of the two, but including the first-person mode as a game mechanic was still a terrible idea altogether. For all I know, it was probably just a crap all over the fans who enjoy Metroid Prime. One last thing I didn't like about Other M was the ending. More specifically, when the character Melissa dies. Before this happens, the player is forced into another frustrating first-person segment. What I didn't know at the time was that once the two mutated creatures aren't in your way anymore, you're supposed to lock onto Melissa and the next cutscene will trigger. That was confusing all on its own, but I honestly thought the ending was handled pretty badly. I dare say it's the only part of the story I really didn't like. Melissa gets frozen by a freeze gun, and then Galactic Federation troops just open fire on the poor girl left and right. Yes, I honestly felt bad for Melissa dying, though the reveal of Anthony still being alive made me feel a little better. As for the rest of Other M's story, it's unoriginal, yes, but I think it's still enjoyable for what it is. Metroid fans will definitely disagree with me on this, but I thought Other M's story was milestones better than Prime's. It wasn't enough that Prime had such bad controls, still talking about the GameCube version mind you, but the story was a complete mess too. When Samus is on the frigate Orpheon, and escaping after killing the Parasite Queen, she sees Meta Ridley break free and head to the nearby planet, Talon 4. But as Samus is still trying to get back to her ship, her suit gets damaged, causing her to lose several abilities and weapons. When she finally does get back to her ship, she immediately heads to Talon 4, presumably to stop Meta Ridley. When I first played this in 2008, I thought it was an interesting setup. Go to Talon 4, get abilities and weapons back along with new upgrades, and defeat Meta Ridley once and for all. Simple enough, right? Well, unfortunately, this is where the story falls apart for me. When Samus arrives on Talon 4, she explores different landscapes across the planet, mainly to get either new abilities or weapons, along with the ones that she lost when her suit got damaged. At a certain point in the game, she comes across and scans some ancient artifacts that reveal secrets about the Chozo, a race of bird-like aliens that raised Samus after her parents were killed by Ridley. It sounds pretty cool, right? Getting to know more about a civilization that took Samus in as one of their own when she had no one else to rely on, and learning about their origins? Well, it certainly would be, if it were the actual main story. But it isn't. It's treated as a side quest, whereas the more important thing is to go after Meta Ridley. Near the end of the game, there's an enemy that Samus faces called Metroid Prime, most likely why the game has the title it does, that, let's be honest, comes out of left field. It's almost as if it was a last-minute decision when the game was still in development. Worst of all, I think, Samus conveys no emotion at all and feels like she has no purpose. She's just there. I have absolutely no reason to like this character. Sure, one could argue that she felt she was in danger when Meta Ridley escapes from the frigate Orpheon, and that she needed to stop it before it causes a lot of destruction on the neighboring planet, but even that is stretching it. It certainly doesn't help that she has no one to interact with as she goes along. Granted, the Metroid series is known to give the player the feeling of isolation, but here, I feel it's all wrong. Sure, Samus is the only character who can even stop Meta Ridley, but it still feels like she's just there. Even as good as the graphics and soundtrack of the game are, Metroid Prime still sucks. The landscapes of Talon 4 are not interesting, Samus is just there, this Metroid Prime feels like it was added in at the last minute, the whole story is just a complete mess because it doesn't know what it wants to be, and learning more about the Chozo's origins would be cool, but it ended up not even worth doing because everything else about the game is either terrible or just boring to sit through. Oh, and it's a long one too. Normally, I don't mind long games, but Metroid Prime was just so boring, it was too much for me to handle. I will admit that I never finished Metroid Prime, but I have seen playthroughs online, which is how I found out about scanning the artifacts and the Metroid Prime boss, and I never want to go near this game ever again. But you know what my biggest problem with Metroid Prime is? As bad as it is, and trust me, it's really not good at all, it still gets praised by fans, which angers me because Other M didn't get the same treatment, and yet it's still a much better game. Yeah, some parts of the story didn't make sense, and it did have its frustrating moments, but it's nowhere near as long as Prime, and it's a bit more linear, which isn't a bad thing. It definitely helps that Samus has other characters she can interact with, and honestly, the voice acting isn't terrible. I don't know why people don't like the voice acting, but it's really not all that bad. It's not great, but I wasn't expecting anything Oscar-worthy. The controls aren't the best either, but they don't feel nearly as unbearable as Prime's controls. I am aware that Prime got re-released in 2009 on the Wii as part of the Metroid Prime Trilogy collection, which also includes Metroid Prime 2 Echoes, which also got released on the GameCube, and Metroid Prime 3 Corruption. The motion controls actually make the gameplay much better, but the other problems I have with Prime 1 still rear their ugly heads. Now, I want to make this perfectly clear. As much as I defended Other M, it is not my favorite Metroid game. Fusion is. I still like Other M, but it's not my favorite. It's better in a lot of ways compared to Prime, but Fusion blows both of them out of the water, and is the one I go back to the most. It has the best story, Samus is technically by herself, but still interacts with an AI system. Not to mention, she's not just a stoic hero this time around. She's a living character and develops as such. And let's not forget what I think is the best villain in the series. The SAX. I cannot stress just how much I love the SAX as a villain. It's basically an evil version of Samus, but at full power. There's also the fact that because Samus is partially Metroid now, the SAX could just take her out in a matter of seconds, meaning it's not just an intimidating threat, but it can be pretty scary at times too, making its presence feel that much more intense. This is why I think Fusion is the best Metroid game ever made. Other M is alright on its own, but I personally still think Prime is the worst Metroid game ever made. Had it been an original or different series with different characters, I probably wouldn't be as harsh towards it. Sorry guys, but I think Metroid Prime really does suck balls, and is a good example of how not to make a first-person shooter. I know it technically is more of an action-adventure game, but you're mostly in a first-person perspective and you shoot things. So at its core, it's an FPS, and not a good one at that. Another thing to keep in mind. Metroid Prime was essentially Nintendo's answer to Halo on the original Xbox. Most people don't want to admit it, but it's sadly true. Nintendo saw how popular Halo was at the time, paving the way to modernize the first-person shooter genre for the home console market. Now, I'm no Halo fan, but I can understand why it was a big deal for that series, and the genre it's a part of. Nintendo thought they could do the same thing for their console with games like Metroid Primes 1 and 2, as well as very butchered ports of good FPS games like Turok Evolution, some of the early Call of Duty games, Time Splitters, Future Perfect, and the only FPS that's only slightly worse than both Metroid Primes 1 and 2, The Sum of All Fears, based on the movie starring Ben Affleck and Morgan Freeman. I'm sorry everyone, but I just can't be convinced that Metroid Prime is a good game, because it really isn't. I know there are lots of people who enjoy the Prime series, but I just don't. If it wasn't for Other M, I wouldn't care about the series like I do now. Yeah, it's pretty flawed, no game is perfect after all, but is it really as bad as everyone says it is? No, it's decent at best. And that's exactly the score it ended up with online, which is fine by me. I'm sorry if I didn't explain well enough why I don't like Metroid Prime, but this is the best way I could. I'm not trying to make believers out of everyone because I know lots of people enjoy it. I honestly didn't make this to dump all over part of a series Metroid fans enjoy, but it did leave such a bad taste in my mouth, so of course I wasn't going to say nice things about it. On the opposite side of the spectrum, Metroid Other M is nowhere near as bad as it's been made out to be, but I get the feeling Metroid fans, especially those who enjoy the Prime series, will think I'm wrong for liking Other M because I think it did its job a lot better than Prime ever did. But this is my honest opinion. I think Prime is, and always will be, the real black sheep of the series. Most importantly because Nintendo wanted in on the Halo craze and somehow succeeded when they should have failed miserably. I will happily play Other M, Fusion, Zero Mission, hell, I'd even prefer that Federation Force spinoff that no one likes over Prime any day of the week. Yeah, I said that, and I'm not taking it back. Though, at the end of the day, it isn't even really the fault of Retro Studios that I think Metroid Prime sucks. They did go on to make Donkey Kong Country Returns, and I thought that game was a lot of fun. If anyone should get the blame for Prime's existence, it should be Nintendo. Like I said before, Metroid Prime was just Nintendo's answer to Halo, and it's not nearly as interesting or as good aside from the visuals and soundtrack. I do understand that a lot of people like it, but unfortunately that doesn't make it a good game. I've already gone over what I hate about Prime, so I won't repeat myself. I just hope everyone who watches this understands where I'm coming from, and why I really don't like Metroid Prime as a whole. The Metroid series overall is pretty good, but not every game is a winner.